Kia ora tātou. Now, in this next sequence, we're going to look at how to set up the Raspberry Pi with some software so that it will work as a broker, okay? Let's start with this Raspberry Pi. I got this Raspberry Pi quite a long time ago. This is the Model B. It came out about 2012. It's quite old now. It's quite slow, but actually it's suitable for what we're going to do here. And what I'm going to do is just give you a rough introduction to this. So what we've got here is we've got Ethernet cable interface, got two USB ports stacked here, got an HDMI port and a power supply. So if we come over here, you'll see that actually what I've got plugged in is I've got the Ethernet cable and I've got a power supply plugged in, and actually I've got my software is installed on this SD card. Now the power supply for these devices needs to be fairly powerful. You cannot use a cheap charger that you might use at home for your phone, okay? You need a decent powered one. So you'll find that you have problems with your Raspberry Pi running it if you don't have a good enough power supply. Normally you need about at least 2.5 amps capability, and sometimes 3. And a charger one typically won't work very well because it's just not set up to supply that sort of current continuously. So I've got the old Raspberry Pi, and what I want to do then is I want to install a version of Linux on the Raspberry Pi, and the version that I've chosen is from dietpi.com. Now dietpi.com has a very cut down version of Linux, which is great for an older Pi like this. Okay, and you just go to dietpi.com and you find out about it. What you need to know is that you need some software on how to actually upload this to the Pi, and the software they use is Balena Etcher, it's called. It's a really useful little program. You load the file that you want to put onto the Pi, SSD card, make sure this is configured to the SSD card, and then just flash it. You'll find out all this information, okay, on one of these topics here. Now to do that, I needed a mouse and a keyboard and a monitor connected to the Pi to start with. But in its normal mode, I don't use a keyboard or mouse. I run it in what's called a headless configuration. So basically it's just a power supply and a network connection, and that's it. So what you do is when you first plug it in, you need to set all this up. Now if you're going to start from scratch, then you need a keyboard, a mouse, monitor, network cable, turn it on, and then it's going to prompt you with a password. It takes a while to do this sort of setup. You're going to drink a lot of cups of coffee or tea while you're doing this, okay? And there's a login prompt. You have to put in root to start with, and then the password is dietpi to start with, and then you wait quite a while. They ask a little survey, and then the next thing that happens is this dietpi software runs, and it will ask you if you want to change your password. So I've changed the password. My Pi has a password of EE101, and that's the lowercase. And the other thing I've changed is I've had to change my time zone and my locale to New Zealand, okay? The next thing it's going to do is it's going to want you to set up maybe a new name for your Pi. You can call it My Pi or anything like that you want to call it. And then the next thing you need to know about is your IP address. Now I've already said that IP addresses are unique identifiers. And when you connect something to your router at home, it automatically gives you an IP address. You don't have to worry about configuring it or anything like that. It's all automatic. And it just has a whole bunch of IP addresses on its network that it gives you. That's not good enough for a server. For a server, we need a fixed, or as we call it, a static IP address. So we have to set up a static IP address in our Raspberry Pi. So we might go back to our dietpi software. I'll just fix my spelling mistake there. And you can go through and set up a static IP address. Now I've set mine to 192.168.1.101, okay, and then it'll select go and then wait again, because this initial setup process takes quite a long time. When the setup is finished, you can reboot your Raspberry Pi so that everything is nice and tidy and done. And you could type in reboot, but it probably won't work because you're logged in as, at this stage, probably logged in as the dietpi user. And it's quite important you understand this idea about users and levels of things that a user can do in a Raspberry Pi or in any Linux system. So here we're going to run the reboot command as the super user, SU. So this is do the command, super user do reboot. So that's what sudo means. And then your Raspberry Pi will reboot. Now at that stage, you need to check that you can actually log into your Raspberry Pi and see that it's working before you disconnect all your keyboard and monitor. Okay, so what I often use is a little program called ZenMap, which is quite useful for checking things out on an internet, because it can check to see if a particular port is open on a computer. So I put in here 192.168.1.101 for my Raspberry Pi, and then I've said, hey, I want to look at port 22 to see if I can connect to it. Now port 22 is the secure shell port for our system. So I just local IoT systems. So secure shell, which is the shell is the command line interface. Often you'll hear it referred to as bash, because that's a common command line interface which is used on Linux. SSH, or secure shell, and it runs on port 22. So we're just going to check to see what port 2 is up to, and I'm going to run this software, and when it's finished running, it looked like it might not be running here at the moment, but basically it's going to say, hey, it's okay, and I got everything I wanted to check that port 22 was okay. Don't seem to be running at the moment, but that's okay. I've already done that once before. So now we're running, we've got we're setting up our Raspberry Pi. Once you know it's working okay, then you'll be able to disconnect it. Another way to check that it's working okay is to open up your command line again and ping it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, here's my IP address. Well, I'm going to ping, and this is a really useful command to know, 192.168.1.101, and this is going to send a little ping command, and it's going to say, are you there? And hopefully it will respond and say it is. Okay, so it said okay, it got a reply, and it only took this amount of time. So when you do the ping command on Windows, it does a very simple 4 pings to see if it's there and just how long it took. So that tells you now that the Raspberry Pi is alive and working. And using ZenMap, you can say that port 22 is open. So now you can shut down your Pi, disconnect your monitor and keyboard and mouse, and just plug in the power supply and the network cable, and we can communicate with the Pi. Now to do that, what we need is a piece of software on our computer called something. PuTTY is one type of software we can use for communicating over a secure shell over port 22 to the secure shell in Linux, so, or in our Raspberry Pi. So I'm just going to start PuTTY, show you what it looks like. So here's PuTTY. Basically I've got port 22 set up here. I can type in 192.168.1.101 and then open the connection, or you can actually save these connections. I've already got my connection saved as EE101. So if I load EE101, you'll see that actually I've put in the username. So I'm going to connect to my Pi as the user diet Pi at 192.168.1.101 on port 22, and I just open that now. And what's going to happen then is it's going to pop up and ask me for my password, which I've set previously as EE101. So I just entered that, and there we go. We are now into the secure shell. So you know how I've pinged the Raspberry Pi from my computer? Well, now I'm going to ping my computer from the Raspberry Pi. So I'm going to go ping, and I'm going to go 192.168.1. Now the IP address of my computer is 75. So although I'm sort of typing this in on my computer, it's actually a window into Linux. So these commands are not sent to the local computer. They are sent to the IP 101, which has got Linux version running on Raspberry Pi. So I'll just ping that, and there we go. Now it's pinging, the actual Raspberry Pi is pinging my computer. Now this, in Linux, when you run ping, it just goes forever, so you just Control-C to stop that, and it's going to say how many packets of information and worked. Okay, so that's cool. what we've got now is we've got the bottom part of our system working. So that means that we can now run our Pi and begin to install all the rest of the software that we need to turn this into an IoT device, an IoT broker. So the first thing we're going to do is, actually, I really like to install a piece of software called Midnight Commander. And I'll show you this now, because what we're going to do is we'll go back into, we'll just copy this command, sudo dietpi software. Now what this does is it goes and runs the initial setup software again from our Raspberry Pi. So I've got a couple of terminals, here we go. Now if I copy it from here, all I have to do in the terminal here is just right click and it will paste it in. Okay, so it's a really good thing to know. Now I'm going to run my dietpi software setup. I have to run it as super user, and I'm just going to push enter. And what that will do now is just configure my initial software setup, just check its database. And this is how you go about installing software on a dietpi. Now the software that's here is actually pre-configured for a dietpi, so it's really useful to use this software. You could also go sudo apt get mc, or you could do it in here, but I'm going to search for it. So in here you have to use your keyboard controls, your arrow buttons, and I'm going to go enter search, and I'm just going to type in MC and push enter, and it's going to see if there's any software that it knows about, which is pre-configured for dietpi, and you'll find that MC, Midnight Commander, powerful file management, and it is indeed, it's one I like. Okay, just hitting the space bar, we'll select that, tab to OK, and then you'll just go down here to install, and you'll install it and take a little while to install. And when you're finished installing, you can just exit. Okay, now I've already installed it, so that's cool. So I'm going to start MC, Midnight Commander, just by typing MC. And here's the nice little interface you get. It's an easy way to manipulate the file system in Linux, okay? And you can see if I click on this double dot, it takes me back to the root file system, which is this slash here. And I can just make this a little bit bigger, get a bit more screen real estate. And you can see this is the file system. We've got a folder called bin, boot, dev, etc., home. And actually home is quite good. So if I go down to home, push enter, you'll see that this is where my user dietpi is configured. Okay, now one thing I want to show you about here is, now I started this program not as the super user but as dietpi. So let's just go back. You can see that I'm user dietpi, and my machine is configured and named dietpi. And when I start MC, I start that as the user dietpi. And you can see when you go in here that certain things are owned by dietpi as a user and certain things aren't. So I'm going to click on here, and I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to look at this chown, which is change ownership. Okay, and this is going to tell me that actually it's the user dietpi and the group dietpi own this folder called dietpi. So that's the username and the group name, okay, and it's dietpi over here. So I'm just going to click that tab around to cancel, into that. But if I go back up to the home directory and I do that, and I go to File, chown, okay, you'll see that this is owned by the user root in the group root, okay. So dietpi user cannot do any changes to this. It cannot change anything that it doesn't own, okay. So I'm going to cancel that. And when you're doing setup information using this, you need to start F10 to quit. You need to start MC with sudo, okay, because then you can actually do configuration changes. But you've got to be careful, because you can break your file system and destroy it, because you might delete something that doesn't belong to you or didn't want to delete. So yes, while you're doing setups, you're going to use the sudo command, but normally you might not, because you're only working in your own directory. So I'm going to start this, and we're going to have a look around, because the next thing I want to do is look at a web server, okay. So that's enough for this sort of second little introductory video about setting up the Pi to start with, and it's a bit of a kickstart. Cheers.